that evolution is bunk science. You cannot understand the events of the Passion without understanding the creation and the fall of Adam and Eve. You cannot, because the Passion began in a garden, just as creation began in a garden. When Adam and Eve fell, they covered themselves with fig leaves. When our Lord fell, they took off his cloak and they stripped him, so he was naked. And then he was nailed to a tree that represents the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
It is.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Special guest today, Mr. Michael Hichborn of Lepanto Institute. He is the founder and president. If you don't know what the Lepanto Institute, I suggest you look it up. They do a lot of investigation into corruption, especially in the church in America. Lots of great work. And today, we're going to be talking about creation and evolution. Both of us are creationists, and we're going to discuss why that's the case and why we're not a bunch of crazy fundamentalist wackos for being so. And you're not going to want to miss this. Stay tuned.
Hi, my name is Peter Nelson. I am president of Nelson Insurance Advisors. We specialize in using non-woke Catholic fraternal insurance companies in order to protect our clients and members, whether it be in regards to life insurance or retirement planning. We have over 23 years of experience in the insurance industry, and we want to do business with people that believe the way that we believe. So please reach out to us at 423-793-2613, or you can find us on our website at nelsonplan.com. God bless and Godspeed.
But so you're the president and founder of Lepanto, and a lot of my viewers will know, but if I missed anything or anything going on right now that you want to discuss, maybe just tell us what you've been up to recently.
Sure. We're currently doing a review of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development. Their grants lists had not been published for almost 3 years, and they published them just before Christmas this year. So when you've got 3 years worth of grants to go through, it takes a while. So we've been processing those grantees and looking into them. Hopefully we'll have a string of reports about that coming out soon. Right now, of course, Catholic Relief Services is campaigning since they've lost a bunch of funding from USAID and the federal government. And I just started a series, I published the first in the series about 2 weeks ago, on CRS's history of lies and cover-ups. And I started with Germain Grisey. You can go to the website, take a look at that series. We've also got a series of reports coming out about Teilhard de Chardin.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So
that's fascinating.
You don't want to miss those either.
That's really fascinating. I'm just going to show your website on the screen here. Let me see if I get the right button here. I have all these different scenes or whatever that I pick from. Guest share screen, that's what it is. So here is your website, Lepanto Institute. I'll put the link for this underneath, ladies and gentlemen. You can find everything. It really is a very, I would almost say like an eclectic website in the sense where you have your hard-hitting stuff, but then you also have the sort of apologetics and sort of deeper articles as well. It's a really nice place to go.
I appreciate that. Yeah, we try to keep it as well-rounded as we can.
Okay, so let's get into it then, because you just mentioned Teilhard de Chardin. And my book, What Happened to Catholicism, is coming out it is the 9th, so in 6 days. And it's about modernism, going through the encyclical Pascendi by Pius X. And although Teilhard de Chardin was after that era, he was a young priest at that time. Nonetheless, he was obviously a huge modernist. And so in my book, there is a lot of reference to Teilhard de Chardin in one of the chapters. And Teilhard de Chardin was a huge evolutionist. Yep. And both of us are not evolutionists. So I guess maybe you could tell us, why aren't you an evolutionist? Because all the really smart people are, and you're a big dummy if you're not. So why don't you want to get with the times?
Well, I was a contrarian from a kid, so it starts there. You know, when my parents, I loved dinosaurs as a kid. Absolutely loved dinosaurs. I wanted all the dinosaur toys. I wanted all the dinosaur books. I had them all. And when we, studied Earth history and things like that in grade school, you get introduced to the millions and millions of years ago, and this is the process. And I started asking questions from a very young age. I distinctly remember when we were being taught about Lyell and his layers. And they said, oh, and he discovered these layers and found that there are different ages and epochs that came with these layers. And I used to, when I was a kid, I would just observe things. And I remember thinking about those layers and then going out to, there's a track, like a football field and a track behind the school. And we would go run the track during PE. Well, going down to that track, there was kind of a dirt road pathway and there was a lot of erosion. You could see the water cutting its way through the dirt, because we live in Virginia, so it was red clay, but in that you could even see layers. Now, I remember looking at the gutters and watching water flow through these gutter systems in right next to the street and seeing all the silt and buildup forming these layers along the gutter. And I would look at it and say, well, these layers didn't take millions of years to form, didn't take
Yeah.
hundreds of years to form. It took a few days, maybe even a few hours. So when we were taught about Lyell, I distinctly recalled a lot of the observations that I had personally made as a kid. And I would say, well, how does this work? How can he conclude that each layer came at a rate of about 100 years and that those layers are consistent? How can he prove that? How can he come to that conclusion just by looking at it when I can observe the creation and formation of layers in a matter of minutes? And my teacher didn't have any answers. And that started me on the path to saying, you know what, there's a lot of conjecture here with regard to the age of things. And then I started asking questions, well, how is a fossil formed? How come I can't dig around in my backyard and find fossilized deer bones? So I
How
just
old
kept
were
asking.
you? How old were you with the layers moment?
Um, I would say I was like fifth grade. So what is that? 12 years old,
It's
11,
funny.
12. Something like
Yeah, it's funny because when I was in grade 4, I remember we were studying the different types of rocks and sedimentary and igneous and whatever. And I remember when we got to the sedimentary and they were trying to explain, like, the soot and the stuff, it, packs down and then more and more.
that.
And
Hmm.
I remember thinking to myself, I'm like, that's dumb. Like, I don't know how else to
Yeah,
explain it. I just thought, I guess like I'm, the answer on the test is whatever, but that doesn't seem probable to me. And I just thought about, how many zillions of rocks are on Earth and all the like I was just thinking about that doesn't seem like that would ever happen. Like I can't imagine any conceivable scenario except for the one that's been hypothesized. Sure, I mean they can hypothesize whatever they want. But from the get-go, I thought to myself, the odds of, X amount of stuff being in, whatever spot for X amount of time with being undisturbed and not being washed away and so on and so forth with the right pressure and then baked in the sun and then more, like it just all these things. I thought this is like science fiction. And I just remember thinking that as a kid being like, this doesn't make sense.
sure. Uh,
Yeah.
I was very inquisitive as a kid. I asked tons of questions, and most of the time, my teachers didn't have the answers, and they would
Yeah.
just say, "It's not on the test. Don't worry about it." But I asked questions about the layers because the layers didn't make sense. It didn't add up to me. I also, I mean, I was 5 years old when Mount St. Helens erupted, and I remember uh, a friend of mine, he had a jar full of ash from Mount St. Helens, and I saw inside that jar there were various layers. It was just from the ash itself. You could see different color toned layers in the jar. So I would ask questions about that. Well, then they would get to the evolutionary stuff. Okay, well, the dinosaur came from the whale. The whale came, became the chicken. The chicken became, it just went on. And of course, they're just giving it to me as a given. And I wanted to know how that worked. Well, how? What's the process? And they would tell me, well, it's a biological process that does this. Okay, well, how does that work? And they would say, well, it comes from a mutation. Okay, well, what's the mutation? and where did the gene that generates the feather or transforms a scale into a piece of human skin, what gene is that? What was flipped? How did
Well,
that
it's in the
happen?
missing link. It's in the missing link.
Well, we hear about the missing link, and I would say, well, okay, how come there's no link between apes and man, but there's also no link between any of these other animals either?
Well,
And
the only thing we know about the missing link is that it's missing,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
as Chesterton said.
right. And of course, in asking questions about how did this work, how did that work, they would then point to the fossil record. And I said, okay, great, we have a record. That's fine. How is a fossil formed? And they didn't really want to talk about it, and I wasn't sure why. They didn't want to talk about the process of fossilization. Finally, they revealed, well, the fossilization process requires an immense amount of pressure and an immense amount of heat. And I went back into the text and I said, okay, so what you're telling me is that this diagram showing a dinosaur dying, lying in the ground eventually rising up over the dinosaur over a period of time, then the flesh rotting from the bones while it's in the ground, this is wrong then. You're telling me that this diagram is wrong. So my teachers did not like me in my science classes because I kept asking these questions and they couldn't answer them.
You know, I never studied science much in school. I think I stopped after grade 10. The way it worked here for like getting my diploma was you did have to have 3 science credits, or if you took a tech, I took this like information technology computer stuff in grade 9, so it counted. And I disliked science classes. And I kind of thought to myself, I thought of myself as being a very non-science interested person. But I had this other hobby the whole time, and I still have it, that I was really obsessed with physical training and stuff for sports. So I was reading all these magazines over the years that were all these studies and whatnot, and I looked at it like it was just something I was reading for fun. And then later on in life, when I was a teacher and I wanted to talk about creation and stuff as I was teaching Catholic theology to my high school students, I was getting all these questions about the science side of things. Then I went and looked into the literature and I said, oh, I've been reading scientific journals since I was 14. They were just about weightlifting and protein synthesis or whatever. But to me, it was just stuff in a magazine. And then when I started looking into the literature, really looking into it, I said to myself, there's no consensus amongst any of these people. And that's kind of like one of the dirty secrets that the whole actual evolutionary world has. When you look into what their experts say, whether it's Professor so-and-so, there's lots of different guys, different universities, people speaking at conferences or whatever. When you actually do what you did and break the process down and say, I understand what you're telling me. I understand what you're saying. You're saying because of what we believe about what happened, all of this has taken place. Fair enough.
Right.
But when I ask you to actually show me how that happened, repeat the process, observe the process, show me an actual evidence of it, not an inference. That's different than evidence. An inference is we could all infer a lot of things, but unless we actually see what did it in the end, it's all just a guess. And they just can't, and none of them do. And the honest ones will admit that. And what you find when I had a PhD of evolutionary biology on my channel from he was from Oxford last year, and he's not I think he's an ancient Earth, but he's not an evolutionist at all. And he just breaks down why evolution is impossible from his obviously highly esteemed credentials in a very prestigious institution. And he basically said to me, he goes, in the actual field of, doing evolutionary stuff, none of it's actually evolutionary the way people think it is. So they look at like the mechanisms of biological organisms that change and adapt to circumstances and whatnot. And it's just under this umbrella. What they actually do is empirical science. What they posit is hypothetical. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things that they don't account for, I mean, there are many things they don't account for. They don't account for irreducible complexity. So if you're talking about something like the eye, a lot of people like to use the eye as an example. I like to go to other processes in addition to the eye and point out that the human breast is absolutely fascinating. And I don't mean that just as a man. I mean that I mean that because scientifically, there are certain things that are happening when
Yeah.
a woman breastfeeds her baby
It's
that
crazy.
cannot possibly have evolved, because the woman's breast detects through the saliva of the baby
That's
the
nuts.
sex of the baby.
Yeah.
So she knows the breast then augments the milk. It feeds a different milk to a male than it does to a female.
That's bananas.
Most people don't know that. That's something that is not changeable through an evolutionary process, because there is no mechanism that says, well, we need to change things in order to fix this or resolve that, because what you're talking about are a set of hormones there's a connection here. And it's a human connection that goes beyond just mere science. It has to be a spiritual one as well.
Yeah,
And
but
that
Michael,
spiritual,
but Michael, sorry to interrupt. If you just give it a bazillion years, of course you could get that. Yeah, it's like magic.
it is magic. And unfortunately, the whole thing is predicated on this idea of magic. And here's the other thing. Okay. The reason I reject theistic evolution, I think that theistic evolution is actually the more ridiculous position
I think it's
than
worse.
merely
You're right.
scientific evolution. Because what they say is that, well, it's a scientific process until we can't explain it, and then God did it.
Exactly.
Well, now you're not talking about science,
You're doing
and you're talking
theology.
about a myth.
Yeah. You're doing theology. That's why I say to these people, you're not doing, so you're like, when the atheist types, the Darwinian types, or like the Charles, what's his name? Dawkins, right? Is it Charles Dawkins or Richard
yeah.
Dawkins? So
Richard
that's Charles
Dawkins.
Darwin, Richard Dawkins mix. That's like a, ooh, that's a villain right there. But, yeah, when they do the debates with the various, smart Christians, I think one of the worst things is that usually these guys are theistic evolutionists trying to show them why God is in all the different things that they all accept as true processes that they've not observed, but whatever, assume. And I think it would be better for just an extremely intelligent creationist to just destroy the process of evolution to the person rather than try to say this is why theology is reconcilable with it. Because then at that point, you're just doing bad theology.
Well, you're not just doing bad theology, but now you're making yourself a fool in front of the evolutionist.
Yeah.
Because you're now looking at the God of the gaps. You're saying, we're no longer able to explain something scientifically, so now we're going to insert a God of the gap to explain away the thing that we can't explain. So how do you go from an ape to a human? Well, you insert a soul. Well, what's the evolutionary process for that? It's not. It's actually a theological process. Well, what's your theological basis for that then? Oh, we don't have one, but we think that that's possibly how it happened. And that assuages our guilt from going away from the way God told us things happened. And it makes us feel better in front of the evolutionists who hate us.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to pick up there about the evolutionists who hate us in a sec, but when you mentioned it was the human breast, one of the things, two things for me that really made me kind of like almost laugh out loud because it was so absurd to think it would evolve was two animals. One is the lungfish. Have you ever looked into the lungfish? It's insane. Like it basically has like one heartbeat every 6 months and it's like stuck in the mud and then it rehydrates. Like that's just stupid. Like that's the most unevolutionary thing you could ever imagine, because those would just go extinct or they would migrate away. They wouldn't like, oh, well, let's just chill in the dirt, and we'll
look at the sunfish.
Yeah, the sunfish. And then the camel. The camel got me because we were at a petting zoo or whatever. And I guess it wasn't a petting zoo, it was a proper zoo, but it was the petting zoo area because they're kind of docile and except that they spit on you. And I'm looking at this camel and I said to my wife, I said, this is really stupid because, and by this time, it wasn't like she was an evolutionist and I was trying to prove anything. I was just, daydreaming, as I'm sure you're wont to do as well. And I said, sweetie, for this thing to happen, like, let's just kind of break this down. So we're in like, Northern Africa, whatever, some Northern Africa, Middle East, 250,000 years ago, 500, whatever, make it up. We're there at some point. And there's a drought and all the green stuff's going away and the water's going away. So a group of these proto-camels decide to just tough it out for a while. They're not going to migrate like the instinct would tell them, because every other animal that is observed anywhere on Earth migrates away from a drought. You know, the deer and the bison, they go across the plains to go where the whales go around the world to where the feeding is in different parts. But this one said, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to walk out into the heat and I'm going to almost die. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to drink a lot of water and just overhydrate myself. And then I'm going to go do that again until I die. And then I'm going to tell my offspring to make sure they keep doing that. And we'll do that for about 50,000 years, let's say. And then eventually, like, it just, when you think about it, you go, this animal would not live. This is that's anti-evolutionary in the way that it should be understood.
Well, I brought up the sunfish. You look at the sunfish. The sunfish can barely swim. It has no natural defense against enemies. It's massive. So it should be a plentiful food source, but the only defense that it has is that it tastes awful. And so the sunfish, and the reason it tastes awful is because since it can't really swim very well, it stays near the surface of the water, and that sun beating down on it actually tends to cook the flesh meat on the top of the fish, and it makes it almost like this overcooked, nasty thing. And it just floats in the ocean, and its sole purpose is to reproduce. And it barely even does that well. So
Like
you look
pandas.
at the sunfish. This thing should have gone extinct years and years and decades and aeons ago, but it's around. But I look at these different creatures, and I look at the processes by which they exist even now, and I try to take that evolutionary step. Well, how could it possibly have gone from this to that? Or how could it have developed this? And the answer is it can't.
It can't.
It can't, because you can't give something you don't have. I have a scar on my wrist because I accidentally cut myself when I was about 11 years old. And this scar tissue, is actually a strengthening tissue. It's stronger than regular skin. That scar, it doesn't really have a whole lot of sensation. It's stronger than the surrounding skin, which makes it tougher, which makes it more defensible, right? And yet, we have how many years of human history? The evolutionists want to say, well, there's about 100,000 years of human history, which
Whatever
is
it
nonsense.
yeah.
But okay, let's take 100,000 years of human history. How come I'm not made out of scar tissue? Why am I still made out of skin?
Yeah.
How come the calcium deposits that formed on my broken bones are stronger than the surrounding bone? How come I don't have strengthened bone deposits all over my body?
Yeah.
And the answer is because you don't pass down what merely happens to you in this life to your offspring.
That's right. Otherwise, my children would be born with beards.
Right. Aren't they
No.
though?
No, they're not. No, they're not. They don't have beards till they're about 7 or 8. They're not. It's not too crazy. But yeah. And well, you mentioned something there. You mentioned the process of not being able to give what you don't have, and this is a philosophical thing, and it's pretty basic. Efficient causality, sufficient causality, whatever you want to call it. This is something that if you know, in all things that are observable, whether it's a metaphysical thing, like an idea, or whether it's a physical thing, like some sort of process, if there is not contained in that what is necessary for the change or the adaptation to take place in the thing that it generates, you can't expect that thing to show up. So,
Right.
You know, let's take even just metaphysics. And this is one thing, too, that I really harp on in my upcoming book. And this is why Pius X so expertly says that the solution to the modernist crisis is return to scholasticism, because we need to have sharp, precise, hard and fast, non-negotiable metaphysical principles, because the error in philosophy of modernity of Kant and Hegel and Hume and Descartes and all these men who brought us these ideas that gave us all this subjectivism and so forth, they messed with metaphysics. And that's why we have evolutionary sciences, is because what the evolutionary sciences are doing in their hypothetical realm, not in their practical realm where they do things that they can actually observe, and that's not even really evolutionary, but in the hypothetical, what they do is they're positing things They're hypothesizing things that they can't prove physically and are absurd metaphysically, but they don't have strong metaphysics. So it just gallivants around the world with all the ignorant people who just believe it because they don't have the philosophical bulwark to guard against it. So take for an idea, for example, like, if an inventor has an idea about how something ought to work, if the idea is stunted, meaning he hasn't accounted for X, Y, and Z, he can't get the thing he's looking for. He has to start again, and he has to posit a new idea with new principles that will allow something to actually work in reality. And this applies to physical reality as much as metaphysical. And this is something that's flatly denied by all the intelligentsia who push these ideas. Sorry for the interruption, ladies and gentlemen. If you're still listening to this podcast, it means you actually like my show. And if that's the case, then you might like going on a pilgrimage with me and a traditional Catholic priest to the Holy Land this fall. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And if you're interested, the information for that is linked down underneath. You can go to kennedyhall.ca/holy-land. That's kennedyhall.ca/holy-land. I hope to see you there. Back to the show.
It's also a denial of the principle of non-contradiction.
Yeah.
Nothing can both be and not be at the same time, which means that, and that principle is applied not just in the physical realm, but also in the biological realm. You can't have a bird and a reptile at the same time. It's one or the other. You can't have a fish and a mammal at the same time. It's one or the other. You can't have something that's alive and dead at the same time. It's one or the other. But it also applies in terms of theology and philosophy. So with theology, a lot of times this is why it's important to understand that evolution is bunk science, because the evolutionary ideologies that are applied to biology are the same philosophical and logical constructs that they use to talk about the transfer of doctrine and the change of doctrine, the evolution of doctrine.
Yep.
So they want to say that in philosophy and theology, something is both this and that at the same time, which is why you have the modernists who say, well, there are no intrinsic evils because it all depends on circumstance, which is to say that sodomy is not intrinsically evil, which it is.
Yep.
And if they can say that there's a circumstance in which it is acceptable, it's morally acceptable, or morally permissible, or at least morally neutral, then it can't be intrinsically evil. So they try to come up with all kinds of excuses and ideas and possibilities that allow for it to be not evil. But the problem is that there are certain things that are intrinsically evil and they can never not be evil. If that were not the case, then a lot of the teachings of the Catholic Church just fall to the wayside. The whole underpinning, the whole structure of Catholic theology just drops.
Well, those were the three pillars of modernism, according to Pius X, was agnosticism, which is not just, like I say in my book, I joke about, the freshman comes back from college, he says, I'm an agnostic. Okay, that's hype, but no, the actual philosophy of agnosticism it's not completely relativism because it's kind of like the seed of relativism, but anyway, it's a primary axiomatic principle. And then you have immanence, which is religion is alive in the sense in the interior form, and that's it. It's not external. Faith is something that bubbles up from the inside. And then evolution. And Pius X talks about these three pillars, and evolution is one of them. And, he castigates the metaphysical belief of evolution, of this type of constant flux in doctrine and truth and so forth. And, I'll see these theistic evolutionists, some of these conservative Catholic apologists and so forth, try to say, well, he wasn't talking about physical evolution. And I'm like, you're missing the whole point. The metaphysical is higher. The metaphysical is it encapsulates. You have to have the principles in check before. It's like before you build the bridge, you have to have arithmetic.
Yep.
So it's not lesser because he's not talking about biology, because it's more vital to talk about the metaphysics. And if it doesn't work in the metaphysics and it doesn't make sense, it can't work in the physical.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's big.
Right.
Okay, so you mentioned Teilhard de Chardin at the beginning, and you have some work coming up on your thing about him. we should talk about him for a minute because he's not some afterthought. He's probably one of the most important. Actually, did you ever read Wolfgang Smith's thing against Teilhard de Chardin?
No. Mm-mm.
I think Angelico Press publishes it. I never read it. I've read excerpts of it. But Wolfgang Smith he had an amazing kind of one-liner to show why evolution was just bunk. God rest his soul. He just passed away. I think he was 94. And
Oh, goodness.
he was still doing interviews until he was like 93. Like, he was sharp as a tack.
Mm.
He's like a car that nothing was wrong with it, but eventually the chassis just breaks while it's driving. He was totally sharp, and then he just kind of died. Like there was no decline, really. But he said, evolution he called it a heresy, and he says it's the belief that created things create themselves.
Yes.
And I just thought that's the perfect way of talking about it. And he wrote a book against theistic evolution, basically going against Teilhard de Chardin, that I want to read, and I'm pretty sure Angelico has it. But Chardin was active in the world of archaeology, of paleontology, we would say.
Yep.
And he was a Jesuit priest. But when you
He's
look
an
into his work, anthropologist, he was a fraud. Like, when you actually look into his work, he was a fraud and a modernist. Do you want to maybe elaborate on who he was a bit?
Yeah, he helped create the Piltdown Man hoax.
And Peking Man as well, or something?
Peking Man, yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So he helped create these hoaxes that showed that they took together some bones, and they actually aged the bones by covering them with some sort of aging agent to make it look older than it was. Then they took some teeth from a different site, and they said, "Oh, we found this along with these bones," and they tried to say that this creature was some sort of amalgamistic thing that was actually the Neanderthal man, or some sort of former generate. It's the missing link, effectively, is what they were trying to say. And it's all bunk. He made it up.
Yeah, he did. And that's an interesting segue into how many hoaxes there have been in evolutionary stuff. Like, I don't think a lot of people realize, ever since day one, the discoveries of the Nebraska man was like a tooth of a wild boar or something.
That's all it was.
Like, you've read Everlasting Man by Chesterton. Oh my goodness, that's my favorite book. I could read that book 100 times, and I've probably read it 12 times. And he goes on and on about the absurdity of the evolutionary stuff going on in his age, the 1920s and 30s. And he says they'll find a hip bone of some sort of animal in Java, and then within 24 hours, there's a drawing of it in the newspaper with the color of hair and everything that it would have.
It's been going on for centuries.
It's crazy. And they're all like that. I mean, people need to really look into what they actually say when they say they discovered some sort of hominid. Don't go to the museum and look at the display. Look into it and say, what did they actually discover? And you'll find that it's like half a femur and like 4 fingers, and they're within 2 meters of each other. And then they recreate the whole thing and say, this is an early hominid. And you're like, that's like a koala bear or something. Like, that's just whatever. That's something else. It's crazy. And Teilhard de Chardin was part of this hoax stuff since the beginning.
Yeah, but then when they find a hammer, the head of a hammer with the attachment still connected to it, in rock that's among, say, the Jurassic
millions,
period, millions of years ago, well, suddenly that's an outlier, and that we're not going to count that. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Oh my goodness, you're right. And but Chardin, so he was part of these hoaxes, but he was Jesuit, and corruptio optima pessima. The Jesuits were the best, and then the Jesuits became the worst. The corruption of the best is the worst. And I feel bad for the decent Jesuits still around. I love Father McTagg, for example. I think he's a wonderful writer, and he's so orthodox and so smart, and he's so witty and funny. And that poor man to have to carry that weight of all the bad ones running around. But Chardin was really, like, if we could say in the objective sense, he was very intelligent in the sense that he was a genius with his ability to convince and his ability to be prolific and whatever, like a very classic modernist in that sense. But when you actually read his work, you go, this is complete nonsense. And
Yeah.
there's some dubious origins as well, I know from his early life.
Yep.
You know about this where he talks about the thing and whatnot. Do you want
The
to just
thing. The
enlighten us a
Mongolian
bit on
desert.
that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure. It was, I think it was 1908 or 1909. He was wandering around the Mongolian desert, and what he wanted to do was to offer the mass on the altar of the world, is what he was looking to do. He was trying to figure out how to do that, but he didn't bring with him any of his mass kit or anything like that. He was going to allow God to give him the means necessary to offer this mass. And that's when he noticed the thing. He said it came like a swarm of birds and swirled around like a whirlwind. And then it came down and it spoke to him. Of course, he wrote all of this in the third person, which is extremely weird, and you know, also probably a sign of diabolical possession. But he wrote
Yeah.
this in the third person, and he said that this thing started talking to him, and it introduced itself to him as the Spiritus Mundi, the spirit of the world. Now, I did I don't know if you saw the talk that I gave a couple of years ago for the Coalition for
Yep,
Canceled
I was there.
Priests. Yep. So you saw the one where I was comparing what he wrote with William Butler Yeats's poem, The Antichrist.
Hmm.
And right there, he talks about this whirlwind, as Yeats talked about a whirlwind. He talked about this thing slouching through the desert. He met this thing in the desert. This thing introduced himself as the spirit of the world, and the thing in Yeats's poem was the Spiritus Mundi. All of this came together, and you go, I wonder if William Butler Yeats, who was an occultist, maybe had some sort of demonic vision of what was going on there in the Mongolian desert. Well, and this is a little bit of a segue, but you see things going on right now in the church, like in Germany, and they on Earth Day they had this huge mound of dirt built up around the altar so that they could offer the mass on this mound of dirt that is specifically regarding Teilhard de Chardin. He wanted to offer the world as a sacrifice on the altar of the earth. And it goes beyond this idea, well, not this idea, but the reality that Christ himself came down from heaven, died for our sins, is offered, represented in an unbloody manner, the sacrifice at Calvary. And Desjardins takes that and reinvents the mass into something that it was never intended to be, and it translates into Gaia worship.
Yeah. Yeah, and he said something weird when he offered that, faux mass as well. What did he say? He didn't have his missal or whatever, so I can't even remember, but it's very, very strange. And I imagine you'll have some references to that in your work, but also when he was a kid, he had some moment where it was like he knocked up against some iron or something like that, and he had this freak out moment. Did you ever read that story? And he went weeping to his mother.
I remember reading about it, but I didn't quite catch what it.
It's in the Foundations Restored series from the Kolbe Center. It's in the first couple episodes. It's fascinating. But yeah, he was a very messed up individual, and very sad man. I mean, obviously did very preposterous and evil things, but he had a weird beginning in his life as a child. And but he gave us some pretty whack theology, and he would talk about the new sphere and whatnot, which maybe you can describe it, but when I read that, I went, oh, he's talking about like religion as if it's 5G. It's like there's this super substantial substrate of consciousness or something. And who pushes
Right.
the same? Who pushes the same idea as him is Jordan Peterson.
Well, it's also the same ideology of David Hume.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
the idea. Yeah, it's the idea of the what is it? The collective consciousness of David Hume. So yeah, we're all connected mentally, and then we can come to a consensus on theological matters because it's now the new understanding of the sensus fidelium. So it's kind of a twisted perversion of what the church really does teach. And then that also translates into the cosmic Christ and how we're all coming to that, the Omega point.
Yes.
Where we're all ascending into this cosmic Christ, which is part of Gnosticism. Because if you understand what Gnosticism is, where everybody is a shard, they're a spark of, you watch the Transformers, they talk about the all spark.
Yeah.
That sounds familiar. If you read about what Gnosticism is, you know exactly what they're talking about. They're talking about the source of all life. And so everything is pointing back towards the source of all life, reclaiming everything into its one little thing. And so we all become a speck in the cosmic Christ.
Well, you know what that is as well. And yeah, like I always say this, there's like four heresies and they just kind of come in different versions,
Mm-hmm.
and Gnosticism is one of them, and it's Eastern pantheism. It's,
Yeah.
it's the Brahman and the Atman, and, we're all sort of, for now, individuals, but not really, because we get absorbed back into the sort of initial source, which is really synonymous with the universe, but it's also divine. And this is why, as the culture goes more and more atheist, it goes more and more Eastern in its stupid practices. Yep. So it's like, belief in God goes away, so people start doing Eastern meditation practices and so forth. And transcendental meditation and yogic stuff and all these kinds of things. Because that is, in a sense, that's the natural state of fallen man. When man isn't really an atheist, when he's not a Christian, he's a pagan. And
Yep.
and he's usually pagans or some sort of pantheist. And what Chardin would talk about is he would talk about, the cosmic Christ and all these kinds of things. People need to understand, you and I were just chatting about Humani Generis before we came on, the document from Pius XII. When Pius XII supposedly gave, permission to research and discuss some aspect of evolution, which he really didn't the way people think he did, but he put up these very severe guardrails. And he said in the beginning of the document, which no one ever cites, they only cite paragraph 36, they don't cite the 35 that come before that make any belief in evolution impossible. They cite paragraph 36, and he goes through like existentialism is not permissible, which he defined it as basically the denial of essences and natures, which makes evolution impossible. Anyway, for philosophical reasons. And he castigates the notion of immanentism because he was talking about neo-modernism. And he says that's impermissible as well, that Catholics cannot accept the notion that man or the world could be in a state of evolution presently, meaning that it's continuing to happen. I don't know how one could ever believe in evolution and believe it just somehow stopped. Like if I was going to be an evolutionist, I would be saying, yeah, you know what? In 100,000 years, there will be no more people. There'll be something else that is the next step of us, because that's obviously what's going to happen. And this is what the real, pop culture evolutionist guys say. The Joe Rogan bros and stuff like that. They'll talk about, man is gonna meld. That's a type of evolution. He's gonna meld with AI, and they'll be like this super sentient, like whatever. It's ridiculous. It's dumb, but they're being logically consistent. And evolution as such requires that. And that's impermissible for Catholics, according to the defined and binding teachings from the Holy See that we can look to. And but Teilhard de Chardin rejected all of that. And you know what's interesting? I've been doing some looking into Georges Lemaitre, the progenitor of the Big Bang Theory. He was a Catholic priest. There's a big blind spot there with a lot of Catholic commentators, and I don't want to mention any because some of them are otherwise very, very good, and I consider them friends, and I think they're awesome. Yes. But so if people don't know, Georges Lemaitre was a Belgian Catholic priest who was a physicist, also a Jesuit, and he's credited with being the sort of progenitor of the Big Bang. And he kind of goes under the radar because he said almost nothing in English. It was all in French. And he died, in the 50s or whatever. I was watching an interview, because I speak French. I was watching an interview the other day. There's an old interview of him on YouTube from a Belgian TV station. And oh my, was he a heretic. Like,
wow, really?
It's really bad. And I'm working with someone right now. Modernist. He was bad. And he believed, it's like he read Pascendi by Pius X and said, well, this is a how-to manual. Like it wasn't a condemnation, because he basically said, no, there are two ways of truth. There is the religious and then there is the objective. And he says they don't touch. And he says, so basically, and like it was basically religion is this fantasy, and then there's science, and then sort of religion is, he was just saying the same things that all the various modern Gnostics say. And the stuff that he was saying about how, because people understand as well, the Big Bang Theory is evolution in the cosmos.
Yep.
It's not creation, it's evolution in the cosmos. It's and he talked about it like there was this initial plasma, and then from here we have this expansion, and he called it a bang. I got dumped on by these atheists guys for saying Big Bang. You don't know what you're talking about. It's not really a bang. And I'm like, well, the guy called it a bang. And and it's like this plasma, which I don't even know how there's plasma at the beginning, whatever. And he's talking about it, and it sounds like straight pantheism. It's very disturbing.
Well, the other problem with it is that it presupposes the existence of matter and energy, which is directly contradicted by Scripture. In the beginning, there was nothing.
Yeah.
The world was formless and void. There was nothing there. A void means nothing. There's no thing, literally. So we as Catholics are required to believe that God created ex nihilo, which means there can't be pre-existent matter. There can't be pre-existent energy.
Yeah.
God created the matter and the energy simultaneously. So right off the bat, what he's presupposing is something that is heretical.
Yes.
Because he's now saying that God had to use pre-existent matter and pre-existent energy in order to create the universe. That's heresy. There's another part to this, though, because he's trying to extrapolate things in a backwards manner, which presupposes that the world is the universe is expanding. So he's presupposing that to begin with.
Yes.
But he says, okay, so everything is expanding, which means we have to contract it back to its original point. And that original point is the point from which everything exploded, and that's how you got the Big Bang, et cetera, et cetera. What he's leaving out is that if God created ex nihilo, now you're trying to say we can science a miracle, and we can explain a miracle scientifically, and you can't. If you look at some of the Eucharistic miracles, for instance, there's no process that you can point to that says that in a Eucharistic miracle that shows heart tissue interposed with the bread accidents of the host, and you look at that and you say, okay, we can see the fibers of the flesh interwoven with the fibers of the bread. There's no process to explain it, but as a scientist, I'm going to try and explain it. I'm going to tell you how this happened. You can't. That's garbage. But God even gave us, in the example of the wedding feast at Cana, the means to understand how this works. He gave us not just 6 earthen jars filled with water. 6.
6
Why
days
is
of
that
creation.
important?
That's right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And our Lord, he looked into the water. It doesn't tell us what he did. There's no process. But he then told the servers, take this and give it to the head waiter. The servers were witnesses. They don't tell the head waiter what happened. The head waiter tastes it and says, this is the best wine. So now you've got a scientific expert who is tasting and analyzing what is. So he is saying, I can now observe this wine. It is the best wine. The best wine goes through the best processes, which includes age.
Yep.
In other words, a good wine takes about 5 years. A fine wine takes 10 to 15. He's telling us that this wine took 10 to 15 years to make, except it was made just moments ago.
Yep.
So he's giving us a testimony to age. He's giving us a testimony to time. And if he's a scientist, he's going to tell you, well, it seems to have come from this region of Jerusalem and was grown with this kind of grape. And he's going to give you all of these different kinds of scientific processes to determine exactly what this is and where it came from. The problem is that we know where it came from. It was made through a miracle just moments before. And now you've got this scientist who says, we can look at this and say that this is the best wine. It took years to make, came from this region of Jerusalem. And you have the testimony of the eyewitnesses who say, or who would say if that had been in the story, I saw this happen just moments ago. There was no process. God just spoke and it was.
Yeah. Well, we're Roman Catholics, so we know it's actually Sangiovese. He would have given us a beautiful vintage
Ah,
from Italy. But
yes.
it's funny. I grew up making wine. I know you've maybe heard me say this, but my mother's an Italian immigrant, and my last name is Hall, so I always have to explain this. And I always got to say this to our mutual friend Anthony Abate, because he's like, fourth generation Italian American, and I'm like, nah, I literally lived in Italy as a kid and have an Italian passport. He's like, no, you didn't. And I'm like, yeah, we're just not from the part where I'm not from the part where we're at where they're African, like Anthony is. He's from Sicily. We're from I'm from Tuscany, where we're just blue eyed and stuff like that. We look more European. And he says, your name's actually Pasquale, isn't it? But I grew up making wine with my nonno, and I lived on a vineyard and stuff in Italy. And one of the things, this is kind of a side note, but one of the reasons when I look at when Christ says, by their fruits you will know them, he's obviously talking about wine. He's talking about Mediterranean horticulture and the Levant. So he's talking about figs, and he's talking about grapes and these sorts of things. And we can look at, and I think this is a good way to sort of segue into the close of the interview here in the next 5 or 10 minutes. Just like we can look at the changes since the council, for a quick story. So I was at a vineyard with some friends here in southwestern Ontario, and we're having a tour, and the sommelier was doing a wine tasting for us. It was tasty wine, and the winery was 3 years old. And I said to my friend, I said, I wonder where they got the vines, because there's no way they planted them 3 years ago. It takes about 50 years before you get the vintage and you have a consistent vintage. And he says, what are you talking about? It's 3 years old. So he raises his hand. Sommelier says, oh yeah, they were planted here 3 years ago. He looks at me, kind of laughs, and she says, no, but they brought over from France. They were about 47 years old when we got them, so we're almost at the point now we still have to do blends. And I laughed at him and I said, I told you. And once they're at maturity and they can't produce good fruits, they'll never produce good wine. This is why Christ says no bad tree can produce good fruit. When the vines can't produce, so this is why, and in those 50 years, you will have some years of good harvest and some years of bad, until finally the kinks are kind of worked out and you know what juice you're going to get from those grapes. And then it stays the same. That's why you have to get rid of them. So what we've seen in the last 50, 60 years, trying to hammer in this notion of evolution as something that is acceptable for Catholics, the fruits of it have been sour, and it hasn't helped push the needle one bit. Yeah, there's the odd convert or something who was like, I found this theistic evolutionist Catholic and blah, 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 blah. But it does not push the needle towards Catholic orthodoxy, because people ultimately know if I can reject the first 11 books of the Bible, at least 11 chapters, if I can reject the first 3 chapters explicitly and the rest of them implicitly, then the beginning and the foundation of the Bible is meaningless, and then it has to be some sort of myth. And I think it's been disastrous.
I think you're absolutely right. And then when you look at, if you're going to reject the first 3 books of Genesis just on the merits of science, under the auspices of science, well, you're also going to reject the fall of Adam and Eve,
Of course,
as a literal story. You're going to reject the creation of Eve as a literal story. The fact of the matter is, and this is lost on almost everyone, you cannot understand the events of the Passion without understanding the creation and the fall of Adam and Eve. You cannot, because the Passion began in a garden, just as creation began in a garden. When Adam and Eve fell, they covered themselves with fig leaves. When our Lord fell, they took off his cloak and they stripped him, so he was naked. And then he was nailed to a tree that represents the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
It is the cross, that wood. And I came to this several years ago. I kept looking at the cross and I was like, why did God choose a cross? Why? He could have chosen any means of dying. He could have said, you know what, just cut my head off.
Yeah.
He could have said, drown me in the ocean. Or there are many different ways to execute somebody. He chose a cross. Why? And the wood of the cross, if you think about what happened in the garden, Adam and Eve ate the fruit that was hanging on that tree. What are we consuming in the Holy Eucharist? But the fruit coming from the tree of the cross. We're consuming Christ. When God cursed Adam, he said, "Thorns and thistles shall the ground bear to you." What did he wear on his head? He wore a crown of thorns. When he said that the earth will produce bitter herbs, what happened when he said, "I thirst"? They put bitter herbs on his tongue. Everything about the crucifixion points back to the creation and the fall of Adam and Eve. So the only way you can understand properly the crucifixion is to take Genesis literally.
Yeah. And that's how it was always understood. The only exception in the church fathers would be St. Augustine, but even he wrote a book called The Literal Meaning of Genesis. Mm-hmm. And he had a misunderstanding because of a mistranslation. And he admitted, he said, if I don't understand why this is the way it is, it's a defect in my understanding, not a defect in the text. And even though there was a defect in that particular translation, he meant a defect in the scriptures themselves. But because he was so holy, and I love St. Augustine, he's my patron saint. As a third order member, I chose his name as my my religious name or whatever. And book 10, I think, of Confessions, I think it's book 10. Mm-hmm. He was so holy and he was so humble that he spent I narrated the translation at Anthony Esselin's, so it was about an hour of text. I remember how long that chapter was. And so 40 pages or so. And he spent 40 pages on the first few words in the beginning. God created, etc., etc. And he showed how this ex nihilo creation was the only possible way for anything to exist, and so on and so forth. And he showed sort of this beginning of time and material taking place simultaneously in this continuum, as we call it, space-time continuum, which is, it's a modern idea, but he had it in the metaphysics first. And it's absolutely beautiful. So even and then he believed creation was instantaneous. So people will say he wasn't a literal 6 days. You're right. He thought it happened like that. So 6 days is too long for St. Augustine. So don't go using him for ancient, because that's the opposite. And then, of course, it was based on a mistranslation. But nonetheless, his instinct was perfectly Catholic. And you will not find a single serious Catholic until the last, 100 years, 150 years, that posited anything like that. And we would have to believe, my friends, it'd be very strange that the Holy Ghost would be guiding all of these popes and theologians and doctors and saints and councils and exegetes for so many thousands of years and just missing this huge fundamental detail. And all of a sudden, in the age of modernism, as the world descends into materialist atheism, we finally understand how to look at Genesis. That's just something I can't come to believe.
Yep. No, I completely concur. I think that's the folly of man's pride.
It is. Well, we could talk for hours. I got to go have supper with my family, and you probably do as well. We're in the same time zone. You're in Eastern time?
Yep.
Yeah, so you're probably getting hungry. Well, I'd love you to come back on at some point. Just shoot me a message or whatever, whenever you'd like to, because this has been great.
Absolutely. I'd love to. Anytime.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I will put the link for Lepanto Institute in the show notes, and also you have a YouTube channel as well. I'll make sure I link both those things. You do some great work over there. And if you want to see Michael Hichborn's greatest hits, you can go to Avoiding Babylon, and you can watch him put up with Anthony while Rob covers his face in embarrassment, which is kind of how they run their show. And that's all I got for you. So thank you, my friend. It's been a pleasure. And
likewise.
We'll talk to you soon, ladies and gentlemen. That's all we got for you. So I'll talk to you next time. God bless you all.